She was still in her dress when she knocked on the last door. It was a wedding dress with lace on the sleeves and a row of tiny buttons down the back, each of them fastened by hands that were not hers that afternoon. Her mother's hands, the seamstress's hands, the hands of people preparing Laura Bannister for a day she herself had stopped believing in a long time ago. The dress smelled of starch and orange blossom water. It smelled of the perfume someone else had chosen for her to wear. It smelled of a lifetime of decisions that were never her own. Can you imagine being 26 years old, being in the most beautiful place the town has to offer, with everything arranged, everything planned, everything ready, and feeling that if you say yes that morning, you will lose something you will never be able to name, but that you will miss for the rest of your life? This happened in Cedar Valley in rural Pennsylvania in the early hours of September 14th, 1921. And the only door that opened that night changed everything. Before anything else, before any door, before the cold early morning and the dirt roads that Laura Bannister crossed alone with her wedding dress still clinging to her body, you have to understand where she came from, not the address, the history. Cedar Valley was one of those rural towns that existed with the quiet dignity of someone who doesn't need to explain themselves to anyone. It had a main street made of uneven cobblestones, a main parish church with a white tower, a general store that sold everything, a grocer, a warehouse, a butcher and a barber who cut hair on Saturday mornings and hoarded more stories than any newspaper in the capital. It also had the Bannister family home, which sat on the corner of Cedar Street and Commercial Alley. A two-story house with dark green painted windows, a varnished wooden porch, and an oak tree in the backyard that Silas Bannister planted the year Laura was born. Silas Bannister was 54 years old in September of 1921. He was a merchant. He was honest, he was respected, and he was the kind of man who confused loving with deciding. He loved Laura. That was never in question. The problem was that loving for Silas meant providing, it meant planning, it meant ensuring that his daughter's future was secure in the right hands, and that those hands belonged to someone the town approved of, that the family approved of, that the world he knew approved of. It never occurred to him, or if it did, he waved the thought away like swatting a fly, to ask Laura what she wanted from the hands into which she would place her own life. Laura grew up in that house, under that oak tree, on that porch. She grew up knowing how to read before the neighbors did, keeping books under her bed that her father wouldn't approve of, developing opinions about the world that she learned to swallow before dinner because Silas Bannister's table was no place for certain questions. She wasn't a rebel. She was, quite simply, a woman who had an interior larger than the space the surrounding world had reserved for her. When the engagement to Richard Drummond was announced, Laura was 24 and still harbored a small hope that things could be different. Richard was 31 at the time, the son of Arthur Drummond, a regional farmer with lands that made Silas's eyes gleam in a way Laura recognized without liking. Richard wasn't a bad man. He was, as she gradually realized over time, simply absent, the kind of man for whom you could be or not be in the room, and the temperature of the air wouldn't change. He greeted her with the cordiality of someone fulfilling a protocol. He talked about the weather, about the harvests, about the party that was going to happen at his cousin's farm. He never asked what she was reading. He never asked what she was thinking. And in the beginning, Laura told herself that maybe this was just how it was, that maybe affection would come with time, that maybe she was expecting something that didn't exist outside the books she hid under her mattress. Time passed, and the affection didn't come. The engagement continued. The families gathered on Sundays. The wedding was set for September of 1921, and Laura kept adjusting herself, her posture, her words, her expectations, to fit into that future that everyone around her seemed so satisfied to see built. It was on a Thursday in August, less than a month before the wedding, that everything broke. She had gone to the Drummonds' house to return a silver platter that Mrs. Eleanor, Richard's mother, had lent them for a family luncheon. The kitchen was at the back of the house. Laura knew the way. She walked in without knocking because Mrs. Eleanor had told her to enter as if she belonged there, and from the hallway she heard voices in Arthur's study, the door ajar, Richard's voice clear, her father's voice replying. She didn't plan to eavesdrop. She stopped because she heard her own name. Richard was saying that the contract was almost ready, that the notary would sign it the following week, that the lot on Cedar Street, the lot with the oak tree, the lot where Laura had been born, would be transferred to the Drummonds' name as soon as the wedding was celebrated. Arthur replied that this was the agreement, that Silas had always been a man of his word, that the old debt would be elegantly settled for both sides. The old debt. Laura stood frozen in the hallway for a time she couldn't measure. The silver platter felt heavy in her hands. The corridor smelled of floor wax and pipe tobacco. Outside, a small bird sang on the roof as if the world were normal. She left the platter on the kitchen shelf, slipped out the back door, crossed the Drummonds' yard, passed through the side gate, and walked back home at the slow pace of someone who hasn't yet processed what their ears have brought them. Only when she reached her room, only when she closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed where the forbidden books were hidden, only then did what she had heard take full shape. The engagement wasn't a choice, it was a payment. She wasn't a bride, she was the settlement of a debt. In the days that followed, Laura searched her father's eyes for anything that might contradict what she had heard. Silas came to dinner as usual, asked about the wedding preparations, commented on the weather, served the pot roast. Laura looked at him and tried to find the betrayal, and what she found was worse. She found a father who genuinely believed he was doing the right thing, who loved her in his own twisted and limited way, and who had never thought that such a way of loving could hurt. That didn't ease the pain, it only complicated it. The night of September 13th arrived with the wedding scheduled for the next morning. The Bannister house had been in motion since early dawn. Flowers, arrangements, the wedding dress hanging on Laura's bedroom door like a white sentence with lace on the sleeves. Laura's mother, Amelia, a soft-spoken woman who had spent her entire life carrying her existence with the patience of someone who learned that resisting is more exhausting than accepting, helped her daughter take a warm bath with herbs, comb her hair, fasten the buttons of the dress one by one with patient fingers, and a smile that wanted to be happy but was a bit trembling at the edges. When everyone finally went to sleep, Laura was still awake. The living room clock struck midnight, then 1, then 2. She lay looking at the ceiling, at the dress hanging on the door, at the window that let in a patch of starry September sky. She thought of Richard, who had never asked what she was reading. She thought of Arthur's study and her father's voice being traded for a plot of land. She thought of the next 30 years, 40 years, of the Sunday dinners where she would be the proper wife of a man who didn't see her, and she felt a tightness in her chest that was at once ancient and entirely new. It wasn't a dramatic decision, it was almost silent, the kind of thing you feel before you think. Laura got out of bed, grabbed the leather lace-up boots under the chair, didn't take off the dress because undoing all those buttons alone in the dark would take too long, opened the bedroom window overlooking the backyard, and climbed down the wooden trellis of the porch with the care of someone who had done it before, and she had, at 12 years old, to reach the wild cherries on the tree near the wall. The yard smelled of damp September earth and the lilac that Amelia grew near the fence. Laura unlocked the back gate with the key hidden under the fern pot, and then she was on the street in the early hours of Cedar Valley, wearing a starched wedding dress and hastily tied boots, with no plan other than to no longer be where she was. If you have ever felt this way, in that moment when the only certain thing is to leave and figuring out where to go can wait, then you know exactly what Laura Bannister felt on that cobblestone sidewalk at 2 in the morning on September 14th, 1921. She started walking. The first door Laura knocked on belonged to Martha Cordell, her friend since school days. They had shared desks and secrets, spent entire afternoons on Martha's porch talking about books and dreams with the safe intimacy of people who have known each other for years. The window in Martha's room lit up. There was a moment of silence inside, the kind of silence that precedes a decision. Then the light went out. The door did not open. Laura stood on the sidewalk for what felt like a long time. The lace dress gleamed faintly in the September moonlight. She took a deep breath, turned around, and went to the next house. Mrs. Pendleton, Laura's confirmation godmother, opened the window and looked down with wide eyes, her hair still wrapped in sleep rags. When she recognized Laura in a wedding dress in the middle of the street at 2 in the morning, she shut the window with a sharp crack. From inside, her husband's muffled voice asked who it was. Mrs. Pendleton replied that it was no one, that it was the wind. The third door belonged to Professor Alden, a 60-year-old man who had taught Laura to love grammar and who used to say that courage was the most necessary of all virtues. When the door finally cracked open and the professor's face appeared in the gap, Laura saw in his eyes exactly what she had found in the other windows, not malice, not coldness, but fear. The old, efficient fear of scandal, the kind of fear that in small towns has deeper roots than any friendship. The professor murmured that he was very sorry, that she needed to go back home, that things could be resolved, that this was going to cause a massive problem for everyone. The door closed. Laura stood in the middle of Cedar Valley's main street in a wedding dress that smelled of starch and orange blossom water, and the September chill she had forgotten to feel began to seep in all at once. She hugged her own elbows, looked up and down the deserted street, and for the first time since climbing down the porch trellis, she thought that maybe there was nowhere to go. There was one last house at the end of the street, just before the path that led up the hill where Cedar Valley ended. It was a small house, built of dark wood, with windows that stayed dark until late at night, because the owner worked past sundown and woke before the sun. The front yard was simple. A few clumps of mint, a wooden bench on the threshold, an iron lantern hanging outside swaying slightly in the early morning breeze. There was a carved wooden sign above the door that read, in discreet, well-crafted letters, Caldwell, carpenter. Laura had passed by that house hundreds of times in her life without ever stopping. She knew the owner's name because in Cedar Valley everyone knew everyone's name, but she knew little more than that. Ernest Caldwell was the carpenter who lived alone at the end of the main street, who didn't show up at town festivals or Sunday services or the Bannisters' Sunday luncheons or anywhere else where the people of Cedar Valley usually appeared to be seen. There were no bad stories about him, only an absence of stories. He simply existed in Cedar Valley without partaking in it, and the town had concluded, with the lazy logic of small communities, that someone who doesn't mingle must have a reason not to mingle, and that this reason should be enough to keep a distance. Laura looked at Ernest Caldwell's house at the end of the street. She looked back at the closed doors she had left behind. She took a breath and knocked. There was no long wait. The lantern light was already on. The carpenter was either still awake or had gotten up to work early. The early morning hour was too ambiguous to tell. When the door opened, Laura was prepared to encounter anything. Suspicion, strangeness, another closed face in the gap. What she was not prepared for was what happened. Ernest Caldwell opened the door all the way. He was a tall man with broad shoulders shaped by his trade and hands that belonged to a carpenter, large, calloused on the palms, stained with light varnish on the knuckles. He had dark hair and a simple haircut, a few days' worth of beard that wasn't sloppy, but belonged to a face that didn't care much about what others thought. He had very dark brown eyes, almost black, and those eyes looked at Laura, at the wedding dress, the partially undone hair, the hastily tied boots, the hands gripping her own elbows, and asked none of the questions the others would have asked. He took a step back. He left the door open. He didn't say a word. And that absence of words was, in that moment, the kindest thing anyone had done for Laura Bannister all night. She stepped inside. The interior of Ernest Caldwell's house smelled of wood and sawdust, varnish and wax, with a mild undertone of coffee that had been brewed hours earlier, still leaving the air with that bitter, earthy warmth that is one of the most honest smells in the world. It was a small house, but organized with the silent rigor of someone who learned early on that the order of things is what keeps the world steady when nothing else does. Tools hung on the wall of the workshop that opened to the right. Chisels, rasps, bow saws, arranged by size with the precision of someone who knows where everything is, even in the dark. In the living area to the left, there was a dark wooden table, 2 chairs, a shelf with a few books, and a stack of papers that looked like blueprints and measurements. In the center of the table was a work in progress, a piece of cedar being carved into something Laura couldn't identify at first glance. Ernest went to the wood stove without a word, grabbed the kettle sitting in the corner, checked if there was water, and set it to heat. Then he pulled out the chair at the table with a simple gesture, without ceremony, without the affected solemnity of someone doing a favor and wanting it to be noticed. Laura sat down. The lace dress took over the chair, and then some, spreading out like a living thing of its own. She looked at her own hands. She looked at the cedar work in the center of the table. It was the beginning of a box, she realized now, with hand-carved joints boasting a precision that took years to learn. She looked at the man with his back to her, adjusting something near the stove. How long they stayed like that, she couldn't say. The kettle began to let out steam. Ernest prepared the tea, chamomile, judging by the slightly sweet scent that started to mingle with the wood and varnish, and placed the cup on the table in front of Laura, without fanfare, without the look that asks if you are okay when it knows you are not. Laura wrapped her hands around the cup. The heat of the porcelain against her cold fingers was almost unbearably comforting. Ernest returned to where he had been working, standing near the workshop bench, and picked up a piece of fine sandpaper. He began sanding a piece of wood with the same rhythm as before, as if he had been interrupted a minute ago by some noise in the wind and was now resuming what he was doing. As if the presence of a woman in a wedding dress sitting at his table at 2 in the morning were a perfectly reasonable occurrence on a September night. The sound of the sandpaper on the wood was rhythmic and constant. The stove's flame crackled. Outside, the wind swayed the iron lantern, casting a rippling reflection on the window. Laura drank the tea and cried. It was not a theatrical cry. There were no sobs or despair. It was that other kind of crying, the quiet kind that comes after the adrenaline fades, when the body finally understands that it can let go. The tears ran down her face and fell onto the lace of the dress, forming small, dark spots. She did nothing to stop them and did not apologize for them. Ernest did not stop sanding. He didn't come to her side with comfort or with the words people say when they don't know what to say. He stayed where he was, doing what he did, and this respect for her pain, not turning it into a spectacle. Letting her simply be without needing to explain, was more kindness than Laura had received the entire night. When the tears finally stopped, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a deep breath, and looked at the man at the bench. "Thank you for the tea," she said. Ernest briefly looked up from the wood. He nodded once, with the calm rhythm of someone who accepts gratitude without needing to minimize it or inflate their own generosity. He went back to sanding. Laura looked again at the cedar box in the center of the table, at the perfect joints, carved with a patience she couldn't imagine how long had taken. She asked, without thinking much, who it was for. Ernest answered, without stopping his work, that it was for Mrs. Cora's daughter to keep letters in. He said Mrs. Cora had ordered it for the girl's birthday and that he was behind schedule because the wood had arrived with the wrong grain and he had needed to start over. Laura stared at the box for a moment, at the precision of the joints, at the care visible in every millimetre of sanded wood. "You started over from scratch because of the grain," she repeated, more to herself than to him. Ernest looked at her sideways, with an expression that wasn't obvious. It wasn't surprise, it wasn't analysis. It was almost as if he was checking to see if she had understood something. He answered yes. That there was no use building on top of a foundation that was flawed. The silence that followed that sentence settled in the room, as if it knew it was important. They stayed like that until the sky began to slowly lighten, that grey and rosy light of a September dawn that arrives before the sun and leaves the world looking as if things are still being decided. Laura had fallen asleep in the chair at some point during the early hours, her head tilted to the side, the empty cup in front of her, the wedding dress spilling over the chair, and the floor like something belonging to a past life. Ernest had draped a thick wool blanket over her shoulders without waking her, and he had kept working. Now listen closely. You must be wondering where Laura's relatives were during all this. Where the Bannisters were, where Richard Drummond was, where the whole of Cedar Valley with its long memory and long nose was. The answer is that they were sleeping, because no one in the Bannister house noticed Laura's absence until 5 in the morning, when Amelia went to knock on her daughter's bedroom door to begin the final preparations, and found the bed made, the window open to the backyard, and the dress that was supposed to be hanging on the door missing. What happened in the Bannister house in those early morning hours of September 14th is a story of panic and pots boiling over that Laura would only come to know through fragments that arrived later. Silas woken in a rush by Amelia's voice. Richard Drummond summoned before sunrise, Amelia's friends arriving like a battalion, their faces pinched with worry and the discreet pleasure some people feel when someone else's scandal confirms their own fears. But that would come later. At that moment, Cedar Valley was still asleep, and inside the small, dark wooden house at the end of the main street, Laura Bannister woke up slowly to the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of sandpaper working wood. For an instant, the very first instant between sleep and waking, she didn't know where she was. Then she saw the living room walls, the workshop bench, the wool blanket on her shoulders, the empty cup on the table, and the figure of Ernest Caldwell with his back to her, working with the posture of someone who needed nothing from the world to maintain his rhythm. She looked at his back for a moment before saying anything. "You woke up early," she said. Ernest replied that he hadn't slept at all, that he had a deadline for the box. Laura felt a strange, small warmth in her chest. It wasn't gratitude, or not just gratitude. It was something else, more subtle, which she didn't name because it was too early, and there was too much to sort out before naming any feeling. She asked if she could use the water pump in the yard to wash her face. He said yes, and pointed to the back door without turning around. Ernest's backyard was simple. Packed earth, a crabapple tree, the iron water pump in the corner, a clothesline tied between two posts where he hung the flannel cloths he used in the shop. Laura pumped the water, washed her face, ran her wet fingers over her neck and behind her ears, and breathed in the morning air that smelled of dirt and distant pine. The sun was still low on the horizon, a shallow yellow light that stretched the shadows and made the roofs glisten with night dew. She stood looking at that yard for a moment, at its simplicity, at the crabapple tree with 2 or 3 small, hard green fruits, at the line of flannel cloths, at the complete absence of anything superfluous. There was something about that yard, and that house, and that man who had left the door open without asking questions, that was completely different from anything Laura Bannister had known up to that point. It wasn't grandeur or promise. It was just solidness. The solidness of something built by hand, which stood upright because it had been made to stay. She went back inside. Ernest had placed a second cup on the table and had torn a slice of a loaf of bread in half. Simple as that. No ceremony. without the exaggerated gesture of someone who wants to be recognized for their generosity. The half piece of bread sat there as if it had always been there, as if Ernest's table always had 2 cups in the morning. Laura sat down. She ate the bread. She drank the coffee, which was strong and a little bitter, exactly the way kitchen coffee in a good house always is. Then she stared at the table for a moment and said she needed to explain. Ernest, standing leaning against the workshop doorframe with his cup in his hands, said she didn't need to. She said she wanted to anyway. He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded, and Laura told him. Not all at once. It came out in pieces without perfect order, the way things come out when you are still processing them while speaking. Arthur's study and Richard's voice, her father's debt, the 2 years of engagement that had been the settlement of an account she didn't even know existed, the dress, the doors, the night. Ernest listened without interrupting, without making the face people make when they are formulating what they are going to say while you are still talking. He listened the way he seemed to do everything, with total attention and without urgency. When she finished, there was a brief silence in the room. Outside, the bell of the town church began to ring at 6 in the morning. 1, 2, 3. 6 chimes echoed through the valley and drifted through the open window as a reminder that the world outside existed and was waking up. Ernest said that what her father had done, even if without malice, was not right. He said it with the direct simplicity of someone who has no time for circumlocution and feels no need to soften the truth to make it more palatable. Laura looked at him. She asked if he thought she had been a coward to run away instead of confronting them. Ernest stood for a moment with the cup in his hand, looking toward the window, as if weighing the answer with the same care he weighed wood before cutting it. Then he said no. He said that sometimes leaving is the only honest confrontation there is, that staying when you know it's wrong is not courage, it is surrender, by another name. Laura looked at him for a second longer than was merely polite. Ernest didn't seem to notice. Or he noticed and chose to look out the window. And it was in this moment, in this room that smelled of wood and coffee, with the church bell still resonating outside and the wedding dress crumpled on the chair, that something very small and very important began. It wasn't love. It was too early for it to be love. It was simply the recognition that there was a kind of silence that offered rest, and that this man knew how to inhabit it, and that this was rarer than anything Laura had encountered so far. Before anything else could be said, the morning brought what the morning inevitably would bring. It was perhaps 6:30 when Mrs. Cora appeared. Mrs. Cora was 58 years old, always wore a calico apron tied at her waist, had a walk that was the human version of a hurried duck, and possessed the quality, rare anywhere but especially rare in Cedar Valley, of not judging people before hearing them out. She was a retired grocer, a widow for nearly 10 years, and was the only person in town who knocked on Ernest Caldwell's door without having a carpentry request. She appeared at the window with wide eyes and hastily pinned hair, and when she saw Laura sitting at the table in her wedding dress with a coffee cup in her hand, she did something none of the other people had done all night. She walked in. "Good Lord in heaven," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. Then she walked over to the table, pulled up the 3rd chair that rested against the wall, and sat down with the naturalness of someone who had always sat in that spot. She looked at Laura with an expression that was a mix of genuine worry and a certain relief at having found someone before the situation worsened. "I was the second to know," Mrs. Cora said. "Your mother is already looking. The town will know before 8. Laura nodded. She said she knew. "Mrs." Cora looked at Ernest with the expression of someone who has known a person long enough to skip pleasantries. She said he had done well to open the door. Ernest shrugged slightly. It wasn't modesty, It was a genuine lack of understanding as to why he wouldn't have opened it. Mrs. Cora turned back to Laura. She asked what she wanted to do. The question hung there in the center of the table, between the coffee cup and the unfinished cedar box. What you want to do. Not what you should do, not what would be right. What you want. Laura took a breath. She said she didn't know for sure. She said she had nowhere to go at that moment. She couldn't go back to her father's house, and she had no one who... She paused, looking at her hands. Mrs. Cora interrupted her gently and said that wasn't true. She said there was a room in her house that had been empty since her niece had moved to Philadelphia, and that Laura was welcome for as long as she needed. Laura lifted her eyes to the older woman. Mrs. Cora smiled, a smile that didn't try to solve the situation or pretend it was simple, but that said, without words, that there were people in the world who opened doors without needing a reason. But before Laura could answer, the sound of footsteps on the cobblestone sidewalk drifted through the open window. Quick steps, more than one pair, with the unmistakable urgency of men searching for someone. The three of them fell silent for a moment. Then Silas Bannister knocked on Ernest Caldwell's door. Now, if you want to know what happened when that door opened for the second time that early morning, because what passed between father and daughter that morning was not simple, and what Richard Drummond did when he arrived shortly after was not quiet. And what Ernest Caldwell did while all that was happening inside his own house says more about who he was than anything else I could tell you. Then stay, because the story is just beginning. Before continuing, if you are enjoying this story, let me know in the comments what city you are watching from. This channel exists because of you, and knowing where these stories reach is one of the most beautiful things we have here. Also, tell me if you have ever gone through a moment where the only way out was a door you didn't expect to find open. The door opened. Silas Bannister walked in with the face of a man who had spent the night awake and had not yet fully processed what that meant. His clothes had been thrown on hastily, his shirt collar slightly crooked, the buttons of his jacket mismatched with the buttonholes by one. It was the kind of detail Laura noticed before anything else, because she had spent her entire life looking at her father with the attention of someone who needs to check the weather before opening her mouth. Behind Silas walked Richard Drummond. Richard was 33 and had the face of someone whose pride had been struck in public, which is the worst kind of wound for the kind of man Richard was. He did not have the face of someone who lost something he loved. He had the face of someone who lost something he owned, which is an entirely different expression. And once you learn to distinguish the two, it is very revealing. Silas looked at his daughter. There was a mix of relief in his gaze. She was alive, she was whole, and a painful confusion that hadn't yet turned to anger because he hadn't yet reached the point of fully understanding what had happened. He said her name, Laura. She replied that she was fine. Silas said they had to go back. He said there was still time. He said the priest had agreed to postpone the ceremony until the afternoon, that the guests could be notified, that there was nothing that couldn't be fixed if they went right now. Laura stayed quiet for a moment. Then she said, with a voice that surprised even herself with its firmness, it wasn't anger, it was just certainty, that she was not going back. Silas opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Richard was the first to speak, and he said Laura was causing an unnecessary scandal, that everyone was waiting, that this was a disgrace. He spoke with the voice of someone used to having things resolved the way he expected them to be resolved. Laura turned to him. She asked calmly if he actually wanted to marry her or if he wanted the lot on Cedar Street. The silence that fell in that room was different from all the other silences that morning. It was the silence of a thing said that cannot be put back. Richard stood with the expression of someone who just realized that what he thought was a secret had long ceased to be one. The look he gave Silas was quick and involuntary, and that look, more than any answer he could have given, said everything. Silas averted his eyes from his prospective son-in-law. He stared out the window at the packed earth yard and the crab-apple tree, at anywhere that was not his daughter's face. Ernest had stood still in the doorway of the workshop since the two men had entered. He hadn't said anything. He hadn't stepped forward. He hadn't stepped back. He stood there with the simple posture of someone who is in his own space and doesn't need to justify it. And this quiet presence, this refusal to shrink, had acted as a silent containment that kept the room's temperature below the breaking point. Mrs. Cora, who had remained in her chair with her hands in her lap, then said with the tranquil voice of someone who has the age to speak her mind without asking permission, that the young lady had said she didn't want to, and that, from her point of view, was the end of the conversation. Richard said this was none of Mrs. Cora's business. Mrs. Cora said that when someone comes knocking on her street's door in a wedding dress at 2 in the morning, it becomes her business. There was a moment of tension that lasted perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, holding within it the accumulated pressure of everything. The engagement, the debt, the closed doors, the plot of land, the early morning, the tea, the bread torn in half. It was Silas who yielded first. He didn't yield the way Laura had hoped. He didn't say he understood. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't suddenly turn into a different father than he had been. He yielded the way men like Silas yield, which is by slightly rounding his shoulders and looking at the floor as if needing to see where he was stepping before taking the next stride. He said they were leaving, that this was not resolved, but that they were leaving. Richard protested once more, short and dry, saying there were practical matters to sort out. Silas said they would do it later, and they left. The door closed. The room sat in a long silence. Mrs. Cora let out a breath of relief she had clearly been holding throughout the entire exchange. Ernest returned to the workbench with the same calm stride as before. Laura stared at the closed door. There was a slight tremor in her hands that she hadn't felt during the entire conversation, her body arriving late to what her mind had just lived through. Then, without her expecting it, Mrs. Cora placed her hand over Laura's on the table. Just that. She didn't say anything. She just left her hand there, old and firm and warm, for a moment. Laura looked at Mrs. Cora's hand. She looked at the cup. She looked inadvertently at Ernest's back in the workshop, with his broad shoulders and the steady rhythm of his hands over the wood. She said softly that she didn't know what to do from here. Mrs. Cora replied that for today she didn't need to know anything other than where she was going to sleep, and that was already settled. The following days were the strangest Laura had ever lived. She settled into the empty room in Mrs. Cora's house, which was 3 houses down from Ernest's carpentry shop, with a window overlooking a backyard where an apple tree grew and a rose bush needed pruning. The room smelled of dried lavender and old wood, and it had a patchwork quilt on the bed that Mrs. Cora had sewn herself using pieces of dresses that told stories Laura didn't know. She slept 10 hours straight the first night and woke up not knowing where she was for an instant that lasted just long enough to be frightening. The wedding dress had been folded by Mrs. Cora and put away in a cardboard box on top of the wardrobe without ceremony, without comment, without any dramatics surrounding the gesture. The box sat up there on the wardrobe like any other box holding any other thing. Laura stared at it for a moment on the first day and then deliberately stopped looking. Cedar Valley did what Cedar Valley always did with scandals. It absorbed it, processed it, gossiped about it in hushed tones, and kept on existing. People on the street looked at Laura with the poorly disguised discretion of those who register everything without appearing to be registering anything. Tobias the butcher took a second longer than necessary to hand over the package when she went to buy meat for Mrs. Cora. The barber's wife crossed the street upon seeing her coming, with too much haste for it to be a coincidence. Laura noticed all this and didn't let either of the two weights, the judgment of others and the pain of the situation, bend her. She walked with the straight posture her mother had taught her and the forward-facing eyes she had decided to have for herself. On the third morning since her flight, she went to Ernest's carpentry shop. There was no specific reason she could clearly name. There was, perhaps, the need to thank him more thoroughly than she had managed during that chaotic early morning. There was, perhaps, curiosity about the cedar box that had been left unfinished on the table. There was, perhaps, something even smaller than that, something she wasn't ready to examine. She knocked on the front door. Ernest opened it without the surprise of someone who wasn't expecting it, with his usual direct and neutral expression, and let her in without any fuss. The cedar box was finished on the workbench, ready to be delivered, with perfect joints and a lid that closed with the satisfying fit of well-made things. Laura looked at it for a moment. She said it had turned out beautiful. Ernest said the grain was good, that it was a shame to cover it with varnish, but Mrs. Cora had asked for varnish. Laura asked how long the whole box had taken, starting from scratch. He said about 3 weeks, that he had restarted twice, the first time because of the grain, the second because the lid joint was a millimetre off. "A millimetre," she repeated. Ernest said a millimetre is the difference between a thing that lasts and a thing that one day fails. There was something in that phrase that hung in the air for a moment longer than she expected. Laura stared at the box, at the perfect fit of the lid, at the wood that had been restarted until it was right. She asked if she could stay for a little while as he worked. Ernest said yes. He pulled out the chair from the table. He went back to the bench, and that was the first of many afternoons when Laura Bannister sat at the table in Ernest Caldwell's carpentry shop while he worked, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, sometimes simply sitting there in the silence that had revealed itself as the most honest kind of company she had found in a long time. On that third afternoon, she stayed until the sun began to yield on the horizon, and the light coming through the workshop window turned low and orange. When she got up to leave, Ernest was still working. He was thinning a board of white oak with a hand plane, the motion rhythmic and constant, the wood shavings curling and falling to the floor with a smell that was warm and clean at the same time. Laura said good evening. Ernest said good evening without looking up. She was almost at the door when he added, without stopping his work, that tomorrow he was going to start a dresser and it would be long work if she wanted to come back. Laura stopped at the door. There was something very small and very precise in that sentence. It wasn't an overt invitation. It wasn't performative politeness. It was simply information, offered as information, that he would be there and that her presence wouldn't be an intrusion. She said yes, that she would come back, and the door closed with the soft sound of a thing fitting exactly where it should. That night, in the room with the patchwork quilt and the cardboard box on top of the wardrobe, Laura stared at the ceiling in the dark and thought about that sentence. Tomorrow will be long work if you want to come back. She kept thinking about the way he had said it without looking, as if it were natural, as if she were already part of the routine of that space, in a way he had simply accepted without needing to deliberate over it. She didn't name what she felt. It was too early. There was still too much going on. A father who hadn't spoken to her again, Richard who had passed by on the street 2 days prior with a hardened face, her mother who had sent a note via Mrs. Cora saying she missed her and was praying. There was too much to hold before making room for anything else. But the thought stayed there, quiet and persistent like a wood shaving in the September air, with that smell that is warm and clean at the same time. And Laura Bannister closed her eyes and slept the sleep of someone who, for the first time in a long time, had spent the day being exactly herself. What was still to come? The conversations that would begin after dinner and end when the sky was already lightening. The wooden object that would appear on the doorstep without announcement, Richard Drummond's maneuver that would force both of them to take a stand in public, and the moment when what had been born between them would finally need to be spoken aloud. All of that was just beginning. And perhaps the only thing Laura knew that night, as sleep arrived with the lavender from the pillow and the chirping of September crickets from rural Pennsylvania, was that there was something smelling of wood and coffee that had already begun to feel hard to imagine living without. 3 weeks had passed since the night of the wedding dress, and Cedar Valley had reached the point where scandals go when no one feeds them with news, boredom. Tongues still wagged, because tongues in small towns have the stamina of marathon runners, but the tone had changed. It had subsided from a fever to a background murmur, the kind that accompanies afternoon coffee and doesn't keep anyone awake at night. Laura Bannister had become a story everyone knew, and no one quite knew how to end. And this lack of definition was, in Cedar Valley, almost as unsettling as the original scandal. She had found a job. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been quick, but it had happened the way things happen when you don't wait for the world to solve them for you. Mrs. Helen Vance, who ran the only school in Cedar Valley with an iron fist softened by decades of pedagogical patience, had lost her teaching assistant in August to a marriage that took the young woman to Harrisburg. Mrs. Helen was a 62-year-old woman who had seen too much to be impressed by runaway brides, and when Laura knocked on the school's door one September morning with her hair pinned back and the expression of someone asking for an opportunity and not a favor, she assessed her in silence for a moment and then told her to come back on Monday. The work was humble, organizing notebooks, assisting with reading lessons for the slower students, helping Mrs. Helen grade times tables. The pay was small, enough to contribute to Mrs. Cora's household and buy the essentials. Laura arrived early and left when the last student left, and during the hours at school there was something she hadn't felt in a long time. The sensation of being in the exact place where her skills were of real use. She read well, understood grammar, and possessed genuine patience for those who didn't understand the first time. These were not qualities the marriage to Richard Drummond would have utilized for anything. On Wednesday and Friday afternoons she still went to the carpentry shop. There was a kind of unspoken agreement that had never been verbalized. Laura simply kept showing up, and Ernest kept opening the door with the same natural motion as always, and the afternoon kept following the rhythm that had established itself. She sat in the chair by the table, sometimes with a book, sometimes just observing the work, and they talked, or didn't talk, during intervals that were increasingly less like silences and more like the companionship of two people who no longer needed to fill the space between them with noise. The conversations had started small. About the wood. Ernest had firm opinions on cedar versus white oak versus black walnut, which he expressed with the precision of someone who had thought about the subject for years without having anyone to share it with. Laura asked genuine questions, not the polite inquiries of someone wanting to appear interested, but the questions of someone wanting to understand. And this was something Ernest noticed without naming it, but which made a difference he himself hadn't expected. Then the conversations grew. About the books she read, she had brought a novel by Thomas Hardy one Wednesday afternoon, and he had asked the title with a naturalness that surprised her, because he hadn't asked performatively. He had asked like someone genuinely curious. He didn't read much, he said, because the work took up the day, but he had read a few things. He mentioned a botanical almanac that had belonged to his father, and a woodworking manual in English, translated from German, that he had bought from a traveling salesman in Philadelphia, which contained 3 chapters on joints that were, in his opinion, the 3 best chapters he had ever read on anything. Laura laughed. It wasn't a polite laugh. It was that laugh that escapes when you didn't expect you were going to laugh, which is the most honest kind of laugh there is. Ernest looked at her for a second with an expression that was hard to read. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't discomfort. It was almost something resembling satisfaction, quick and immediate, before he went back to the wood. She thought about that look on her way back to Mrs. Cora's house. She thought about it more than she should have, more than was necessary, and then deliberately thought about something else. It was on an October afternoon, 6 weeks after the night she ran away, that Richard Drummond returned. Laura was alone in the carpentry shop that afternoon. Ernest had gone to pick up an order of wood that had arrived at Tobias's warehouse and had said he would be back in less than an hour. Laura had stayed because she had left her Hardy novel on the table and wanted to finish the chapter. She sat with the book open, absorbed in reading, when she heard the footsteps on the cobblestone sidewalk that she had learned to distinguish. Not Ernest's steps, which were slow and steady, but steps of a different quality, the rushed and slightly irregular quality of someone arriving with something on their mind that is not peace. The door opened without anyone knocking. Richard Drummond stood there with his hat in his hand, and the expression Laura had learned to recognize over 2 years of engagement. The expression of someone used to having conversations end the way he wants, which is different from being used to being right. There was something in the way he looked at the space of the carpentry shop, at the table, the tools, the open book in Laura's hands, that was evaluative in a way she didn't like. He said they needed to talk. Laura closed the book. She said she was listening. Richard took another step inside. He said there was a matter of reputation that needed to be resolved. He said the situation had been left without closure, and that this damaged the names of both families. That there were ways to fix this quietly, that he was willing to consider reopening the engagement if Laura went back to her father's house and did things the proper way. Laura stared at him for a moment. An interesting thing had happened in the 6 weeks since her midnight escape, something she hadn't noticed while it was happening, but which became very clear in that moment, with Richard on the threshold of the shop, hat in hand. She had stopped fearing his judgment. It hadn't been a decision, it hadn't been a dramatic moment. It had been the quiet accumulation of days in which she had been herself without asking permission. And each of those days had deposited something that made Richard Drummond's opinion progressively less heavy. She told him she had no interest in reopening the engagement. Richard said she needed to understand the position she had put her father in. Laura said she understood her father's position and that she regretted her father had put himself in that position by making an agreement without consulting her. Richard wore an expression she had seen before in other contexts, the expression of someone unaccustomed to hearing a no that isn't wrapped in an apology. He said she was being influenced by people who did not have her best interests at heart. Laura asked to whom he was referring. He made a vague gesture toward the workshop, toward the shop itself, toward everything that house represented. And it was in that moment that Ernest appeared at the back door. He had entered through the yard, as he sometimes did when returning from the warehouse with boards on his shoulder, through the back door leading straight into the workshop. He held 2 white oak boards under his left arm and stopped when he saw Richard in the center of the room with his hat in his hand, and Laura standing on the other side of the table with the closed book. There was a silence of 2 or 3 seconds that held within it more things than many speeches. Ernest leaned the boards against the workshop wall carefully, unhurriedly, without the urgency of someone who has just walked into a situation that surprised him. He wiped his hands on his trousers. He looked at Richard with his usual expression, direct, neutral, without hostility and without deference. Richard said the conversation was private. Ernest said, with a calm voice and without raising his tone, that it was his carpentry shop. The sentence was not aggressive. It was not a challenge. It was simply the most undeniable observation in the world, spoken by the man who had built every inch of those walls, and who therefore needed nothing else to back it up. Richard looked from one to the other. Laura stood with a different posture than the one he had found when he walked in. Nothing obvious had changed, but there was something firmer in the way she stood. As if Ernest's presence at the door had added something to the room's air that she had breathed in and was now resting on her shoulders. He said he would return when it was more convenient. Ernest said he could try, but that he couldn't guarantee the result would be any different. Richard left. The door closed. Laura stared at the door for a moment and then let out a breath that was the sum of all the things she had held in during that conversation. She turned to Ernest. He had already gone back into the workshop, picking up the boards to put them in their proper place. She said, almost involuntarily, that he had arrived at the right time. Ernest said he had arrived at the time he arrived. There was something in that response, in the refusal to turn the gesture into heroism, in the way he had simply walked into his own home and stayed because it was his own home, that made Laura feel that small, persistent thing in her chest that she had begun failing to ignore. She picked up her book. She stayed for another hour. That afternoon they didn't speak about what had happened. They spoke about the white oak. Ernest explained that it was one of the densest woods and required different saws depending on the cut, and that a carpenter who didn't respect the right wood for the right tool wasted two things at the same time. Laura listened with her chin propped on her hand, watching the boards he was measuring on the bench. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, without either of them having deliberately moved to make it so, they were close enough that she could see the texture of the wood he was holding, and he could see the notes she had made in the margins of her hardy book, and neither of them pulled back. It was Ernest who said without looking at her that there was a veneer on the wood she could run her finger over if she wanted to feel the difference between raw and sanded oak. Laura ran her finger over the two surfaces. The raw one was rough and warm, full of irregularities that caught the skin. The sanded one was smooth, with an almost silky feel, carrying the unique heat of dense wood that retains temperature in a way no metal does. She said the difference was impressive. Ernest said it was the same piece of wood, that the difference was only the work put into it. Laura lifted her eyes to him. He was looking at the board, but there was a fraction of a second before looking away, just a fraction, where Ernest's eyes met hers. And in that fraction there was something that wasn't just carpentry. She lowered her eyes back to the wood. Her heart did a thing she decided not to think too much about. If you are enjoying this story, before continuing, please take a moment to leave a like on the video. This helps the channel grow and allows us to bring more stories like this to you. Stay with us. The arrival of November brought the conversation Laura knew she needed to have with her father. Silas had sent 2 messages via Amelia in the preceding months, short notes, leaving no room for a reply, saying she should come home and that they could resolve the situation with dignity. Laura had answered both with equally short notes, saying she was fine, she was working, and that when she was ready to talk, she would seek him out. The moment arrived on a Sunday morning when she went to the house with the oak tree alone. The oak tree had small acorns just beginning to form. The yard smelled of the lilac Amelia cultivated. The green paint on the windows had peeled slightly in a corner Laura hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't paid attention to in the way you pay attention to things when you return to a place after being away. Amelia opened the door and stood with wet eyes for a second before pulling her daughter into a hug that lasted longer than anything that had been said in the last few months. She didn't say she was right. She didn't say she was wrong. She merely hugged with the strength of a mother who had spent weeks awake in the early hours. Silas was in the living room. Father and daughter sat across from each other with the dining table between them. The conversation was long and sometimes painful in the way that true conversations are painful, not the kind where someone wins and someone loses, but the kind where both sides reach the end, knowing things they didn't know before. Silas heard, perhaps for the first time in the complete way she needed to be heard, what had happened in the hallway of the Drummond house in August. He listened without interrupting, with the face of a man who realizes, while listening, that an action he had considered a solution had been to his daughter a fundamental betrayal. When she finished, he remained silent for a time. She didn't interrupt. He then said he had done what he believed was right, that the debt to Arthur Drummond had weighed on him for 8 years, and the solution had seemed clean for both sides, that he had never thought of Laura as currency, and that if this was the result, then there was a flaw in his thinking that he couldn't undo but needed to acknowledge. It wasn't a request for forgiveness adorned with pretty words. It was harder and more honest than that. It was a man reaching the limit of what he could say and saying it anyway. Laura stared at her father, at the hair that had greyed more at the temples since September, at his hands lying open on the table, stripped of their usual controlled gestures. She said she wasn't there to fight, that she was there because she still loved him, and that because of that, she needed him to understand what had happened clearly enough so that it wouldn't happen again. Silas said he understood. There was a moment of silence that wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that comes after something has been spoken and truly heard. Amelia brought coffee. The three of them drank coffee at the dining table with the November light streaming through the green window. It wasn't resolved. Things like this don't get resolved in one Sunday conversation because the roots are deep and the rebuilding is slow. But there was a beginning. And beginnings were what Laura had learned, in those recent months, to value with a rigour she hadn't possessed before. On her way out, when she passed the oak tree in the yard, she ran her hand over the rough trunk of the tree. Her father had planted that oak the year she was born, 26 years of roots in the earth and between them. She walked back to Mrs. Cora's house with a lighter heart than when she had arrived. The object appeared on the threshold the next morning. She didn't see it being left there. Ernest had passed by early before sunrise on his way to the warehouse and had left the thing leaning against Mrs. Cora's door threshold without knocking, without a note, without any accompanying explanation. It was a bookmark, carved from light cedar with the same compact precision as always, bearing a small geometric shape at the top. It wasn't ornamental in a showy sense. It was the abstraction of something she took a moment to identify as the outline of an oak leaf. Laura stood with the bookmark in her hand for a long moment on Mrs. Cora's threshold, with the November sun starting to warm the paving stones. Mrs. Cora appeared behind her in her calico apron and looked over her shoulder. She stayed quiet for a second, then she went back inside without saying a word, but there was a smile at the corner of her mouth that she was making a visible effort not to let grow. Laura placed the bookmark in the Hardy novel, marking the page where she had stopped. The cedar carried that scent she had come to recognize as the smell of those Wednesday and Friday afternoons, wood and varnish and patient work. The following Wednesday afternoon, she went to the carpentry shop as always. Ernest was working on a rocking chair that Mrs. Helen Vance had commissioned for her front porch. It was a different kind of work than the others Laura had seen. It required a curvature in the legs that needed steam and pressure and patience, and Ernest was in the bending phase, pressing the wood over a mould he had built specifically for that shape. Laura walked in, sat down, opened her book. The cedar bookmark was on the right page. They stayed like that for a while before she said, without looking up from the book, that she had received a gift. Ernest didn't answer immediately. There was a gap of a few seconds where the only sound was the wood being positioned onto the mould. Then he said there had been a good piece of cedar left over after Mrs. Cora's box. Laura said it looked like an oak leaf. He said it could be anything. She lifted her eyes from the book. Ernest was facing away from her, aligning the wood on the mould with his fingers, and there was something in the set of his shoulders, in that very slight postural adjustment people make when they realize they've been caught in something they didn't plan to reveal so soon, that she saw clearly from where she sat. She said it was very beautiful either way. Ernest said it was the least the cedar demanded when the wood was good. There was a specific way of not saying things that was his language, and Laura had learned to read it. The cedar bookmark wasn't the least the wood demanded. It was more than that, and they both knew it, and the space between what was and what was spoken was full of something that still had no name, but occupied every inch of that room with the same warm, solid presence as the oak wood on the bench. She went back to her book, but she didn't read. She stared at the words without processing any of them, holding the cedar bookmark between her fingers, thinking about oak trees and about woods that take time to dry out, but once they do, they last for decades. It was Mrs. Cora who said it first, on a November afternoon, when the two of them were peeling apples in the kitchen, that man at the end of the street looked at her differently. Laura said she didn't know what she was talking about. Mrs. Cora peeled an entire apple in a continuous spiral without breaking the skin. It was her way of giving people time to arrive on their own where she wanted to lead them. Then she said, with the neutral voice of someone commenting on the weather, that when Ernest Caldwell passed her on the street, he stopped for a second longer than he stopped for anyone else before walking on. Laura said he was polite. Mrs. Cora said that in 20 years of living in the neighborhood, she had never seen Ernest Caldwell stop even half a second longer than necessary for anything or anyone. Silence. The spiral apple peel dropped into the bowl. Laura said that it was complicated. Mrs. Cora said she knew. She said the best things usually were. There was something Laura hadn't yet said to anyone, not to Mrs. Cora, not to her mother, not even to herself with enough clarity to call it by name. It was this, that during the Wednesday and Friday afternoons in the carpentry shop, she had stopped thinking about what she had left behind and had begun thinking about what she was finding. That the silence of those hours wasn't an absence. It was the kind of presence she hadn't known existed. That there had been an afternoon, 2 weeks ago, when Ernest had casually mentioned while working that a book she had referenced weeks prior had stayed in his head, and that detail, that something she had said had lingered in his mind without her knowing, had sparked a warmth in her chest that was still there. She didn't tell Mrs. Cora any of this, but the apple she was peeling ended up with a continuous spiral peel too, something that had never happened before. Mrs. Cora looked at the apple peel and then looked at Laura with that smile that was impossible to hide completely. Laura told her to stop. Mrs. Cora said she hadn't said a thing. December arrived with the heat of the Pennsylvania summer and the smell of warmed earth that was completely different from the damp cold of September. The afternoons in the shop grew longer because the daylight stretched until almost 7 o'clock, and sometimes Laura left when the sky was already turning orange and pink and the shadows of the houses had swallowed most of the street. It was on one of those afternoons that the conversation happened. They had finished talking about the rocking chair. It was almost ready, needing only the final finish, and Ernest had explained he was going to use a mixture of linseed oil and carnauba wax that left the wood looking more natural than varnish. Laura had asked to see how it was applied, and Ernest had shown her, rubbing a cloth soaked in the mixture in slow circles over the wood while she watched closely, and there was something in that gesture, in the patience of the circles, in the care with which his fingers reached the edges, that she watched for longer than was strictly necessary to understand the technique. When he finished and put the cloth down, there was a silence that was different from the other silences. It was a silence that knew there was something needing to be said and was waiting for someone to find the courage first. It was Laura. She said, looking at the rocking chair that smelled of linseed oil, that there was a time she thought there was something wrong with her, that the things she wanted were not the things everyone around her said she should want, that the books and the questions and the desire to understand things were treated as problems to correct rather than parts of who she was. Ernest listened with the attention she had learned was his defining attention, total, unhurried, without the gaze that is already formulating an answer. Laura said that being there in that carpentry shop over the last few weeks had been the first time since she was very young that she had spent time being herself without needing to justify it. There was a pause. Ernest stood leaning against the workbench, his arms lightly crossed, looking at her with that expression that was hard for an outsider to read, but which Laura had learned to recognize as his expression when he was processing something that mattered. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said he understood what she was describing because he had spent his entire life being the person who didn't fit the mold Cedar Valley had prepared, and that he had reached a point where he simply stopped trying to fit. Laura asked if that had hurt. He paused a second. He said at first it hurt. Then it became a habit. That there was a difference between being alone because you chose it and being alone because you gave up trying, and that for a long time he had confused the two. The workshop window was open, and the warm December air drifted in, carrying the scent of the afternoon. Dirt, distant pines, some lilac bush from a neighbor's yard. The sun was low and horizontal, casting golden stripes across the wooden floor of the shop. Laura said, softly, that she didn't think he had given up. Ernest looked at her. It wasn't the split-second look of previous times. It was a full look, holding the duration that looks have when they cease to be accidental. Laura didn't look away. There was something in the silence of those seconds that was the clearest thing that had happened between them since the night of the wedding dress. Clearer than any word, more direct than any gesture. It was the mutual recognition that something had grown in that space between them, slowly and almost noiselessly, with the persistence of things that grow because they want to grow, not because someone planted them with intent. Neither of them said anything. But when Laura got up to leave, Ernest said there was enough wood to start a bookshelf the following week if she wanted to see how a dovetail joint was made. She said she wanted to. She walked out with her heart doing that thing she had stopped trying not to think about. What would come next? The letter arriving from Philadelphia with news about the Drummonds that would unexpectedly change the state of affairs. The night when the situation with her family would reach a point that could no longer be delayed, and the moment when what had grown between Laura and Ernest would finally need to step out of the carpentry shop and be said aloud in front of everyone else, was a few weeks away. But on that December afternoon, with the orange light on the wooden floor and the smell of linseed oil and the cedar bookmark resting in the Hardy novel, Laura Bannister was more whole than she had been in years, and inside the carpentry shop, after the door had clicked shut, Ernest Caldwell stood still for a moment, with his hand resting on the rocking chair, smelling of carnauba wax. Then he went back to work, but not immediately. The letter arrived in the second week of January, 1922. It was addressed to Silas Bannister, bearing the letterhead of a law firm in Philadelphia that neither of them had heard of. Amelia, who had resumed her habit of dropping by Mrs. Cora's house on Thursdays with warm biscuits and updates on the family's domestic state, delivered the news with the expression of someone carrying something heavy without quite knowing its weight. The letter stated that Arthur Drummond had filed a legal suit claiming the original debt from Silas, which, according to the documents presented, had been partially settled on the condition of the marriage and which, with the cancellation of the wedding, reverted to its original pending status with the addition of accumulated contractual interest. In simple terms, without the marriage, the debt was not settled, and without the settled debt, the lot on Cedar Street, the oak tree, the green porch, the house, was at risk. Laura read the letter twice at Mrs. Cora's table, her coffee going cold beside her. There was a specific painful irony in this, that the situation she had rejected upon discovering it was a transaction, was now returning as a collection notice threatening the family's most tangible asset. That her gesture of freedom had real and immediate consequences for the father she had spent months trying to understand. She stared at the letter for a long moment. Then she folded the paper, slipped it into her apron pocket, and walked to the carpentry shop. Ernest was cutting the dovetail joint he had promised to show her with his usual meticulous patience, the cuts clean on the fresh wood. When Laura walked in wearing the expression she had, he set down the chisel. She told him everything. Ernest listened without interrupting, as always. When she finished, he remained silent for a moment, looking at the joint on the bench. Then he asked what the total debt was. Laura stated the amount written in the letter. Ernest stayed quiet for a time, that she didn't rush to fill with words, having learned that his silence was part of his thinking. He said he had that amount saved. Laura opened her mouth, closed it. She said she couldn't accept that. Ernest said he wasn't offering it as a gift. He said he was proposing an agreement, that the money would be loaned with terms and a deadline to be arranged, exactly as he would do with any business deal. He spoke with his usual direct, calm voice, as if discussing the price of timber, but there was something in his eyes that differed from his tone, something older and more personal than any business deal. Laura said the difference was that this wasn't just any business deal. Ernest said he knew that. The silence between that sentence and the next lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Outside, the street of Cedar Valley carried on with the normal noise of a January morning, a wagon rolling by, the butcher Tobias's voice at the adjacent warehouse, the song of a robin in the sidewalk tree. Laura said she needed to think. Ernest said that was fine. He said the proposal would be there whenever she wanted to come back to it. She walked back to Mrs. Cora's house with the letter in her pocket and a heart full of things that didn't fit easily into any category she knew. There was gratitude. That was the simplest. There was the weight of receiving something like that from someone. There was the complication that this someone was the same man who carved cedar bookmarks into the shape of oak leaves and left them on doorsteps without warning. There was the awareness that accepting the loan would change the nature of something that didn't yet have a definite name, but which she didn't want to muddy with debt and obligation. And underneath all of that, there was something simpler and harder than any analysis. There was the fact that the way Ernest had said he knew, his eyes holding hers directly while his voice remained identical to its usual tone, had sparked a warmth in her chest that she was finding increasingly difficult to attribute to anything other than what it was. She slept poorly that night. The next morning, she went to speak with her father. The conversation with Silas was different from the others. There was a new kind of weariness in him now, not the weariness of someone resisting, but of someone who had reached the limit of how much a single way of thinking could bear the weight of the consequences it had spawned. He listened to Ernest's proposal with an expression that shifted through several emotions: pride, resistance, gratitude, and something resembling relief, but which cost too much to admit easily. He said he couldn't accept charity from a carpenter. Laura said Ernest had called it a loan with a deadline and terms. Silas said he knew the difference. Laura said she knew it too, and that the question was what he wanted to do with the house of the oak tree he had planted the year she was born. There was a long silence. Silas said he needed to think. Laura said she would understand whatever he decided, but that if he accepted, it would be a business agreement between two men, with signed papers and clear conditions, the way her father had done business his entire life, and that there was nothing dishonorable in that. She left her father in the living room, with his coffee and the weight of his choices. That same Thursday afternoon, Silas Bannister went to Ernest Caldwell's carpentry shop for the first time in his life. Laura wasn't there. She had deliberately stayed at Mrs. Cora's house because there were things that needed to happen without her in the middle. She learned about it later, in pieces, through Mrs. Cora's partial recounting after watching them from the grocer's window. What she learned was that the conversation had lasted nearly an hour, that the two men had sat in the shop's living room with paper and a pen on the table, that Silas had walked out with the expression of someone who had done something that cost him dearly, but which he knew was right, and that Ernest had stood at the door for a moment after the older man left, looking out at the street before going back inside. The agreement was signed the next day, with Mrs. Cora as a witness, because neither man had thought of anyone else, and she was available and trustworthy, as she always was. The house with the oak tree would stand. That night, Laura sat on Mrs. Cora's porch under the January light, a summer Pennsylvania sky brimming with stars, and felt the weight of all the months since September rearranging itself inside her into something lighter and clearer. She had lost the marriage she hadn't wanted. She had found work. She had rebuilt something with her father, incomplete but true. And there was, at the end of that street, a small dark wooden house, where a man worked with a carpenter's patience and saved enough money for an oak tree, without anyone ever having to ask. She looked at the stars for a long time. Then she picked up her Hardy novel with the cedar bookmark marking the right page. And she smiled at the book with the kind of smile you try not to smile when you are alone, because it is embarrassing to smile like that at a book. What was still missing? The night Richard Drummond would make his final move and force Laura and Ernest to take a stand before the entirety of Cedar Valley, and the words that would finally need to leave the carpentry shop and be spoken aloud, was approaching. And Cedar Valley, at that turning point from January to February of 1922, was about to discover that some stories do not end the way the town expects them to. February arrived in Cedar Valley with the fine rain that rural Pennsylvania knows well. Not a thunderstorm rain, not the kind that scares, but that persistent summer drizzle that leaves the cobblestones slick and the air smelling of wet earth that clings to your clothes all day. Mrs. Cora's apples were ripening on the tree out back. Amelia Bannister's lilac had bloomed more than usual that summer. And in the carpentry shop at the end of the main street of Cedar Valley, a black walnut bookshelf was taking shape, with dovetailed joints that Laura had learned to distinguish from any other joint by sound. That clean, precise fit that makes a soft click when the pieces meet exactly where they should. She had learned other things too in those months. She had learned that Ernest always took his coffee black, but added sugar when he was tired, a detail she only discovered on an afternoon when he had yawned over his cup, and she had commented on it, and he had worn that slightly embarrassed expression of someone caught doing something they didn't know was observable. She had learned that when the wood behaved the way he wanted, there was a very slight relaxation in his shoulders, almost imperceptible, that she had begun to recognize as satisfaction. She had learned that he had read his father's botanical almanac so many times he knew the Latin names of plants without ever having studied Latin, and that he found it unremarkable when she told him it was impressive. And she had learned in the last few days that something was changing in the space between them, not a new change, because the thing itself was not new, but a change in what the two of them were doing with it. As if the unspoken had reached a saturation point where it would either need to be said or explode in silence. It was on a Tuesday in February that Richard Drummond made his final move. Laura knew beforehand, not directly, but through the way Cedar Valley transmitted information, which was via a chain of glances and half-sentences that anyone who knew the town could decipher. Mrs. Helen had mentioned at the end of the morning classes that she had heard the Drummonds were back in town after weeks in Harrisburg. Tobias the butcher had commented while wrapping meat that he had seen Richard at the warehouse the day before with a look that was not for a courtesy visit. And Mrs. Cora had shown up at the school during the lunch hour with warm biscuits and a direct piece of news. Richard had gone to the county clerk's office that Tuesday morning. What he had done at the courthouse, Mrs. Cora didn't know. But the courthouse in Cedar Valley was no place for good news when someone walked in looking like that. Laura spent the afternoon at school with half her mind on the students' notebooks and the other half calculating what was possible. There were few realistic options for what Richard could be doing at the clerk's office, and all of them had to do with the agreement signed between Ernest and Silas, the debt, the land, or an attempt to create some legal snare that would force a review of what had been settled. What she hadn't calculated was what he had actually done. On Wednesday morning, the complete information arrived. Richard had filed a formal declaration at the clerk's office contesting the loan agreement between Ernest Caldwell and Silas Bannister, alleging there were irregularities in the original debt document, that the terms of the 1913 contract between Silas and Arthur stipulated that any transfer of rights regarding the property required the Drummonds' consent, and that Ernest's loan had effectively blocked the execution of that right. In plain language, Richard had found a lawyer in Harrisburg willing to argue that the deal between Ernest and Silas had injured the Drummonds' interests, and he was demanding a judicial review of the entire situation. It was a maneuver. Silas recognized it immediately when he read the document that arrived at his house that Wednesday. A notary from Philadelphia, consulted by letter, replied 2 days later that the contestation was legally weak, but could drag on for months if the county judge decided to entertain the suit. Months of litigation meant months of uncertainty about the land, months of uncertainty about the house with the oak tree. It was exactly the kind of calculated pressure meant to force someone to yield out of exhaustion rather than lose on merit. Laura found out all this on a Thursday afternoon, when Silas came personally to Mrs. Cora's house for the first time since September. He knocked on the door, hat in hand, wearing the expression of a man who had been through a lot in recent months and was reaching the point where he needed to stop pretending he could fix everything alone. They talked in Mrs. Cora's living room while she made a point of staying in the kitchen, from where only the smell of coffee drifted in. Silas said he had made many mistakes, that all of this had started with his decision, and it was only fair that the weight fell back on him, but he said he had a problem that was larger than what he could carry alone, and he asked her what she thought should be done. It was the first time Silas Bannister had ever asked what his daughter thought about anything beyond the dinner menu. Laura looked at her father for a second, at his greying hair, at his hands resting open on his knees. She said she thought Richard's contestation had no real foundation, and that the only reason he had filed it was to apply pressure, not to win on merit. She said that if they responded to the challenge with clear documentation and refused to cave, the probability was that Richard would back down before it went to trial. Because lawsuits cost money and time, he wouldn't be willing to spend purely on pride indefinitely. Silas asked how she knew that. Laura said she had spent the last few months paying attention to things she hadn't paid attention to before. There was one thing she didn't say, which lingered in the air of the room like a silent presence, that she had learned to think that way, clearly, directly, without the embellishment of fear. Partly because she had spent months in the company of a man who thought that way about everything he did. That there was something in Ernest Caldwell's way of assessing wood, seeing the grain, identifying the flaw before cutting, starting over without drama when the material was wrong, that had settled into her without her realizing it while it was happening. Silas said he would think about what she had said. When he left, Mrs. Cora walked in with 2 coffees and sat at the table uninvited, which was her way of saying she had heard everything and had things to say. She said Laura needed to go talk to Ernest. Laura said she was going on Wednesday as usual. Mrs. Cora said she wasn't talking about the lawsuit. Silence. The coffee cooled in the cups. Laura said it was complicated. Mrs. Cora said she knew it was. She said everything worth anything usually was. She also said, with the voice of someone delivering a truth without a pretty wrapper, that there was a whole lifetime of loneliness in a man who opened his door to a stranger at 2 in the morning without asking anything, and that this kind of loneliness wasn't the sort that could be fixed with a cedar bookmark left on a doorstep. It was the kind that needed to be met face to face. Laura stared at her cup. She said she was afraid. Mrs. Cora asked of what. She waited a moment before answering. She said she was afraid that the way this had grown, slowly in silence with all that subtlety, wouldn't survive the weight of being spoken aloud, that some things felt more real before they had a name. Mrs. Cora sat in silence for a moment, looking at her with the expression of someone who had lived long enough to know that this is one of the oldest forms of fear there is. Then she said that in her own life, the only things she truly regretted were not the things she had said that ended up changing their shape. They were the things she had kept hidden and which had vanished without ever being spoken at all. Mrs. Cora's coffee went completely cold without either of them drinking a drop. That night, Laura sat on the porch with her hardy novel in her lap and the cedar bookmark between her fingers, without opening the book. She stared at the end of the street where the iron lantern of the carpentry shop swayed gently in the February wind. The light was on inside. It was always on until late. She went the next morning, a Friday, earlier than usual, before school, before Mrs. Cora's breakfast, with the sun still low and the smell of damp earth from the previous night's rain lingering on the street stones. She knocked on the door with the rhythm that had become her own, 2 firm knocks, a pause, a third, and waited. Ernest opened it. He was already in his work clothes, his fresh coffee steaming on the stove, wearing the slightly surprised expression of someone who wasn't expecting a visitor at that hour, but didn't broadcast the surprise theatrically. Laura walked in. She stood near the table, resting her hand on the back of her usual chair, and said there was something she needed to say before the situation with the Drummonds resolved itself one way or the other, because she didn't want the moment she said it to seem like a consequence of anything, or out of gratitude for something else. Ernest stood in the doorway of the workshop, coffee cup in hand, looking at her. She said she knew she had arrived at his door at 2 in the morning, wearing a wedding dress with nowhere to go, and that he had opened the door and made tea and draped a blanket over her shoulders and had never asked for anything or expected anything. She said she knew that in the weeks and months following it had been her who kept coming back, and that he had let her come back, and that neither of them had said anything about what that meant, but that she had reached a point where she could no longer pretend she didn't know. Ernest said nothing. Laura said she had learned in those months that there was a difference between a life built on what others expect and a life built on what is true. She said the cedar bookmark had been in her hardy book since the day he left it on the threshold, and that it bore the outline of an oak leaf, which she didn't believe was a coincidence, and that if she was wrong, she needed to know right now. The silence that followed had a specific quality. It wasn't the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say. It was the silence of someone arriving at something he had been building internally for a long time, now needing a moment to find the way out. Ernest set his cup down on the workbench. He said it wasn't a coincidence. He said it with his usual direct, simple voice, without ornament, without elaborate construction, just those 4 words carrying the weight of everything behind them. Laura looked at him. There was something in his eyes that she had learned to recognize over the past few weeks as the most honest version of Ernest Caldwell that existed. That moment when his habitual restraint yielded slightly, not much, just enough to let you see what lay underneath. It was the look of a man who had spent years being the person who didn't fit, who had shuttered his windows and kept working, and who was now discovering that there was something he thought no longer existed in him, the desire for someone to stay. He said that when she had walked in that September morning in her wedding dress, and sat in the chair and cried without apologizing, and drank the tea as if it were the most necessary thing in the world, there was something he had recognized without being able to name it in the moment. He said it took him weeks to understand what it was. He said it was the recognition of someone who existed in the same way he existed, with an interior larger than the space the world had reserved for them, and who had made peace with it out of necessity rather than by choice. Laura was listening with the same kind of attention she had learned on those afternoons. Total, unhurried. Ernest said there was a difference between opening the door for someone to come in and not wanting that person to leave anymore. He said it took him time to recognize this in himself because he wasn't used to wanting things that depended on another person. She said she knew. She also said there was something she needed to be honest about, that she had arrived there escaping a marriage that was a transaction, and that the last thing she wanted was for whatever existed between them to carry any residue of obligation or gratitude. That if she stayed, she wanted it to be a complete choice from both sides, without the weight of a debt or a rescue. Ernest said he understood. He said the loan proposal for Silas had been made prior to any other consideration, that it had been a business deal because that was the proper way to do it, not because he expected anything in return. That if she didn't feel what she felt, the loan would continue to be a business deal with terms and a deadline, and nothing more. Laura said she knew that. She said that was exactly why she was there. The fine February rain began to fall outside, that soft drizzle smelling of earth and pine. The low sunlight angled through the workshop window almost horizontally, throwing a golden band across the wooden floor. Ernest walked across the room. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was the same calm stride as always, but with a direction. He stood close to her, on the other side of the table with his usual expression, but with eyes that spoke the thing for which there is no formula to say more eloquently than it had already been said. She walked around the table, and they stood there close, surrounded by the smell of wood and wax and rain, with the unfinished walnut bookshelf behind them and the coffee still steaming on the stove. He said softly that she could stay. She said she knew, and she stayed. There was no grand declaration, no elaborate promise. There were two hearts that had arrived there slowly and carefully, as if each knew the other was the kind of thing that needed to be treated with the precision of a dovetail joint, without forcing, without rushing, with the patience of letting every piece find its exact place. The drizzle fell outside, the iron lanterns swayed on the threshold, and inside that small, dark wooden house at the end of the main street of Cedar Valley, the silence was of the rarest kind of all, the kind where nothing is missing. Take a moment now, before we continue, and leave your like on the video if you're still here at this point. And if there is someone you know who would love this story, send it to them right now. Stay with us, because the best is yet to come. Richard Drummond's contestation was answered in the second week of March, 1922. Silas had followed his daughter's advice. He hired the same notary from Philadelphia he had consulted earlier, sent the complete documentation of the agreement, and waited. Richard's argument was legally weak, as Laura had assessed, relying on a creative interpretation of a 1913 contract that the Drummonds themselves had drafted without much technical rigor. But before any judicial decision could be handed down, something no one predicted occurred. Arthur Drummond came personally to Cedar Valley. It wasn't an ordinary visit. It carried the quality of something that had been thoroughly thought over before being acted upon. The old farmer arrived on a March afternoon in a modest buggy without his sons, and went straight to Silas Bannister's house. Laura wasn't there when it happened. She found out later from the version her father delivered that night, wearing the expression of a man who had spent 2 hours in a conversation that altered something inside him. Arthur had said the contestation was Richard's idea, not his. He said he had known Silas Bannister for 30 years and didn't want this war. He said he had watched from afar what had unfolded since September, and had concluded his son had treated the situation with misguided pride, that Laura had discovered what there was to discover, and had done what anyone with a spine would do. He said finally that he would order his lawyer to withdraw the contestation. The condition, if it could be called a condition, was that the original debt be renegotiated directly between the two of them, using the new terms of the agreement with Ernest as a foundation without the involvement of their children. Silas had agreed. When Laura heard this, she sat in silence for a moment, processing what it meant, not just for the house with the oak tree or the land, but for the entire architecture of the situation. The person who had initiated it all, Richard's father, had also been the one to end it. There was something almost beautiful in the irony of it, the way things are beautiful when life proves more complicated than any story you could invent. She went to the carpentry shop that night. It was late, later than she usually visited, but the light was on, and that had ceased to be a surprise. Ernest opened the door before she finished knocking. Either he had heard her footsteps on the cobblestones, or he had been waiting, and she didn't ask, because either answer pleased her equally. She told him what had happened with Arthur. Ernest listened. When she finished, he said Arthur was the kind of man who would rather lose money than lose the respect he held for himself. Laura said that was a good way of looking at it. Ernest said he had asked himself a question during the afternoon that had gone unanswered. She asked what it was. He said he had wondered what to call what she was to him, that there were categories he knew, friend, neighbor, client, and none of them fit. That he had tried to find the right word and concluded that perhaps the right word was one that hadn't yet been spoken aloud between them. Laura looked at him for a second. She said she thought it was time to say it. Ernest said yes. He said she was the person he had let in when he had no plan to, and that since then he had learned to plan his day around the possibility of her being in it. He said she was the person he had carved the cedar bookmark for without being able to logically explain to himself why a piece of wood needed that specific shape. He said there was a difference between the house before September of 21 and the house after, and the difference was her. His voice carried the same quality as everything he did, direct, unadorned, leaving no room for doubt about what was being spoken. Laura said she had arrived at his door in a wedding dress with no plan and had found tea, silence, and a blanket. She said she had learned in those months that the opposite of loneliness wasn't noise. It was that specific kind of company that didn't need to fill the space to be real. She said she had found that in the carpentry shop, in those afternoons, in that man who paused what he was doing a second longer when she entered the room. Ernest looked at her completely without glancing away. He said he loved her. Simple as that. Without build-up, without beating around the bush. The most direct sentence possible spoken in his usual voice, but with a weight she felt on her shoulders, like something settling rather than falling. She said she loved him too. And the silence that followed that exchange was the rarest and most valuable kind of all. The silence of two people who have said what needed to be said and who require nothing else beyond that for a moment. The iron lantern outside swayed in the March wind. The drizzle had stopped, and the sky was clear with stars, the kind of rural Pennsylvania sky that makes cities seem distant and unnecessary. Inside that small, dark wooden house, the cedar box made to hold letters sat on a living room shelf, finished with its perfect lid joint, and on the workshop bench lay the beginning of something new. A piece of cedar work Ernest had started 2 days prior, which Laura had recognized at first glance, but hadn't mentioned because it was early and other things were happening. It was a door frame. Small, ornamented with a geometric pattern along the edges, he had hand-carved with a fine chisel, the kind you place at the entrance of a house for decoration, or to mark that the entrance belongs to someone who knows how to craft things with the precision they deserve. She asked what it was for. Ernest said he didn't know for sure yet. He said he had started it without having a defined destination. Laura looked at the frame for a moment, at the joints, at the geometric pattern on the edges that was beautiful in the way handmade things are beautiful, with the minuscule imperfection that proves they were made by a human being and not a machine. She said it would look beautiful at the entrance of a house. Ernest said it depended on the house, and there was a smile at the corner of his mouth. Small, contained, the rare kind of smile from someone who doesn't smile often, but when he does it is because there is a real reason for it, which Laura watched for a second longer than was necessary. Then she smiled too. The black walnut bookshelf was finished in the last week of March. Mrs. Helen Vance received it with the satisfaction of someone who had waited without complaining and now confirmed it had been worth it. The dovetail joint, she said, running her fingers over the seams, was the kind of work you could touch 40 years from now and find exactly the same. Ernest said that was the intention. Laura, who was standing nearby because she had accompanied the delivery at Mrs. Helen's request for help positioning it, watched the carpenter explain the wood's characteristics in his usual direct voice. There was something in the scene, Ernest resting his hands on the wood he had built, the Cedar Valley afternoon light through Mrs. Helen's windows, the solid, unpretentious bookshelf in the spot meant for it, that formed the most complete picture of what she had learned about that man in the preceding months, that there was a way of building things that didn't seek admiration. That quality wasn't meant to be shown off. It was meant to be discovered by those paying attention. Mrs. Helen watched them walk out together and stood at the window for a moment with the expression of someone who had seen enough stories to recognize one when looking right at it. April arrived with the transformation that autumn brings to the colors. The summer green yielding to the yellows and oranges that are the season's language of farewell. The rural oak trees had branches with leaves already showing that golden edge. The main street of Cedar Valley held the specific quietude of an in-between month, a time possessing the quality of arriving somewhere without the urgency of already being there. It was in April that Silas Bannister went to the carpentry shop for the second time. Ernest opened the door. The two men looked at each other for a second. It was no longer the look of September 21, nor the awkwardness of two men with an undefined relationship. It was the look of two men who had reached an understanding the way understandings arrive when no one forced them, by accumulation, by time, by evidence. Silas said there was a conversation to be had. Ernest said there was, and he let him in. Laura wasn't there. She was at the school, as always, at that hour. But when she arrived that afternoon, there was something different in the air of the shop, and Ernest was working with a very slight relaxation in his shoulders that she had learned to recognize as the bodily manifestation of a weight being lifted. She asked what had happened. He said her father had come by. She waited. Ernest said Silas had apologized for the way he had handled things, not with grand words, but with the honest simplicity of a man who had taken months to reach that point. He said he saw how Ernest treated his daughter and had recognized with difficulty and some shame that it was the kind of respect he himself had failed to demonstrate. Laura listened in silence. Ernest also said he had formally asked Silas for his blessing. The old-fashioned way, the way the era and the place demanded, not because formalities mattered more than feelings, but because some things needed a ritual to be acknowledged by the world beyond the two people living them. Laura stared at him for a moment. She said he had done that without telling her first. Ernest said there was no way to warn her without making it seem like he was asking permission to ask permission, and that was too confusing. She held that expression for a second. And then that smile she had stopped trying to hold back returned, the kind of smile that doesn't ask permission. She asked what Silas had said. Ernest said her father had stood in silence for a long time, looking at the workshop bench, the tools on the wall, the shelf being built at that very moment. He had run his hand over the back of a chair. He had finally said that a man who builds with such care knows the value of things that last. And that he had said yes. Laura looked at him. There was a warmth in her chest that was the sum of everything. Of September 21st, and the chamomile tea and the wool blanket and the cedar bookmark, and the Wednesday and Friday afternoons, and the white oak and the linseed oil, and the conversations that started about wood and ended up in other places. It was a warmth that had grown slowly, without urgency, with the patience of things built to last. She said yes as well. Nothing more was necessary. They knew what was being said. The April sky in Cedar Valley held that specific late autumn color that is hard to describe to anyone who doesn't know rural Pennsylvania, a blue that darkens at the edges before turning purple, with a band of orange on the horizon that lasts exactly the amount of time you need to look at it before it fades. Through the open windows of the shop came the cool breeze signaling the change of season, carrying that scent of dry leaves and earth that has been the smell of Pennsylvania autumn for as long as there have been people there to feel it. The door frame was almost finished on the bench. Laura looked at it for a moment, then looked at Ernest. She asked if he had decided where it was going. He looked at her. He said he had decided when he started it, but that it had taken until now to say it. He said it was for the door of the house where she went to live, that he had started it before any conversation, before any word was spoken aloud, because there were certain things the hands knew before the head did. Laura rested her hand on the frame. She traced the geometric pattern carved into the edges, the joints, the wood still carrying the warm scent of fresh cedar. She said it was the most beautiful thing she had ever received in her life. Ernest said it still needed a finish. She said she could wait. And in the way she said it, with that new calm she had learned over those months, the calm of someone who had stopped needing things to arrive quickly because she had learned that what comes slowly stays longer, held the entire promise of what was to come. The wedding of Laura Bannister and Ernest Caldwell took place in June of 1922, in a simple ceremony at the main parish church of Cedar Valley, the exact same church Laura had fled past out a back window 9 months earlier. Mrs. Helen Vance sat in the front row. Mrs. Cora cried from before it even began and didn't try to hide it. Amelia Bannister held Silas's hand throughout the entire service, and Silas watched his daughter with an expression that was new to him. Not the look of the father who provides, but the look of the father who recognizes. The priest who conducted the ceremony was the same as always, using the same manual as always, but there was a quality to the silence of those present that made those marriage vows heavier with meaning than they usually are. Ernest stood in the center aisle, wearing a suit he had tailored in Harrisburg, dark, simple, without adornment, and his hair combed with that very slight awkwardness of someone unaccustomed to dressing up and unsure if it looks right. Laura had arrived without a wedding dress. She had arrived in a blue-gray silk dress Amelia had helped pick out, which had the exact fit of a thing made for the person wearing it. When the priest asked, and the two of them answered, "I do," there was a different weight to those words, because it was the first time Laura Bannister was saying yes to something she had chosen with her own hands from the very beginning. The cedar frame was installed on the door of their house that very afternoon. Ernest attached it with his usual care, measuring with the ruler, checking the plumb line, tightening the screws with just the right pressure. Laura watched from the living room, still wearing her blue-gray dress, and there was something in that scene. The man who built things to last putting into place the piece he had carved for the door of their home, with the same attention he gave to everything, that she registered internally with the quality of someone who wants to remember it forever. When he finished, Ernest stepped back to check. The frame was perfect. Symmetrical, firm, with the geometric pattern on the edges visible in the afternoon light. Laura walked to the door. She ran her hand over the wood. She said it was exactly right. Ernest said it was the least the cedar demanded. And there was a smile on him she had learned was his rarest and most honest. Small, contained. The kind that happens when a person isn't thinking about smiling, but smiles anyway. She stepped around and walked through the door with the cedar frame. Home. The years that followed were built with the same patience Ernest used to build everything. The carpentry shop grew, not vastly, not in a way that changed the quiet nature of the work, but enough that the name Caldwell became recognized beyond Cedar Valley. Orders came from Harrisburg, some from Philadelphia, for specific pieces requiring someone who knew how to work wood with that level of quality. Laura stayed at Mrs. Helen's school until the year the older teacher retired, and then she took over the principalship for another decade, transforming that space with the same idea that had guided everything from the start. The idea that people's interiors deserved more room than the world typically allowed. Silas Bannister died in 1931, with the debt settled, the oak tree still standing in the yard, and the incomplete but real certainty of a man who had learned, in the end, the difference between protecting and controlling. Amelia lived another 10 years, and on her final walks down the street, she still stopped at the door of the carpentry shop for coffee. which Ernest always served black, but accompanied by a shortbread cookie he had learned to bake because she liked it. Richard Drummond married a girl from Harrisburg in 1924, lived an ordinary life, and over the years became the kind of background presence that exists in every small town. Someone who was once the center of a story and later became merely part of the scenery. Mrs. Cora remained in Cedar Valley until the age of 78, drinking coffee at the carpentry shop's table with a frequency no one needed to formalize because it had simply become natural. She passed away on a winter morning in 1941, wearing her calico apron, without pain, and with the silent satisfaction of someone who lived long enough to see the stories she helped start reach a good place. The black walnut bookshelf Ernest had made for Mrs. Helen stayed on the school's porch for 43 years before needing any repairs. And when it did, the dovetail joints were exactly as they had been made, without having given a single millimeter. A millimeter is the difference between a thing that lasts and a thing that one day fails. Laura and Ernest Caldwell grew old in that small dark wooden house at the end of Cedar Valley's main street, with the iron lantern on the threshold and the smell of cedar and varnish that never fully left the walls no matter how many years passed. They conversed at the table after dinner with the rhythm that had been theirs from the beginning, sometimes in words, sometimes in silence, and the silence between them held the quality of a handmade thing placed exactly where it belonged. There was one thing Laura said, on an autumn afternoon in 1945, when the two of them were sitting on the wooden porch Ernest had added to the house in the 30s, looking out at the street that had grown wider with the new pavement the town hall had laid down. She said there was a version of her life that had almost happened in September of 21, and that when she thought of that version, she felt something that wasn't exactly relief, because relief assumed there was a real risk of it having occurred. She felt something closer to gratitude for the early morning, for all the closed doors, for the last door. Ernest listened, as he always had. Then he sat in silence for a moment looking at the street. He said he had thought many times about what would have happened if she had knocked on a different door before reaching the last one. Laura said there was no different door, that she had reached the last one because all the others had to be closed. He looked at her. In his eyes, the eyes of a 55-year-old man who had built every inch of his own life, and who had learned, late but well, that some things must be let in for life to fit right, was the exact same thing as in his eyes on that early September morning in 21, when he stepped back and left the door open. Just the simple and absolute decision not to close it. The iron lantern on the threshold swayed in the Cedar Valley autumn wind, and inside that house, the cedar bookmark was still tucked inside the Hardy novel. On the very page where it had first been placed, 24 years ago, bearing the outline of an oak leaf hand-carved by someone who had started without knowing what he was making and who had ended up getting it exactly right. Like all things that are worth it.